The Democrats and the media, arm in arm, in a panic induced frenzy, have pressured their own candidate, President Joe Biden, out of the 2024 race. The very man who delivered more legislation than any president in modern history, who fortified NATO and stood up to Putin more fiercely than any of his predecessors with unprecedented vigor, Joe Biden. Yes, the same Biden who, despite a few verbal slips, has proven time and time again to be a formidable leader. But why did they do it? Because summer polls, as reliable as predicting President Dukakis in 1988 or President Hillary Clinton in 2016, show President Biden trailing a convicted felon, Donald Trump, by a few points. On June 27th, CNN hosted a presidential debate that has since been dissected, replayed, and analyzed ad nauseum. The media focused on polls and Biden's performance for days on end, ignoring Trump's lies on that stage and the historic impeachment articles filed by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez against two Supreme Court justices. The relentless coverage created a self-fulfilling prophecy, swaying public opinion and bolstering the very narratives they criticized. Instead of rallying around their candidate, Democrats allowed themselves to be swayed by the same flawed polling logic that previously led to spectacular misjudgments. The caricature of Biden as senile, largely propagated by Trump's derogatory branding strategies like Crooked Hillary, has unduly influenced public perception, including among some Democrats. This narrative distracts from Biden's substantive achievements and resilience. Biden's record is clear. Under his leadership, the U.S. economy is a beacon of stability, with job growth surging at 42 consecutive months and the crime rate at a 50-year low. He has passed more bipartisan legislation than any of his predecessors in the modern era, including a bipartisan infrastructure bill, which strengthened international allies and brought new dynamism to the American political landscape. This past Sunday, President Biden dropped a history-making bombshell. He will be the first president since Lyndon B. Johnson to not seek a second term. After a tenure marked by sweeping legislative victories, President Biden has decided to pass the torch and step back, leaving his appointed successor, Kamala Harris, to take the mantle. Stepping up to the plate, Vice President Kamala Harris has been revitalizing the Democratic campaign with a fervor that's setting the political world ablaze. The energy around her campaign is palpable, with massive fundraising numbers rolling in and her message resonating strongly with voters across the country. In the latest polls, Harris is making serious headway against Donald Trump, signaling a potential shift in the political winds. The Republican camp, after riding high this summer due to a monumental Supreme Court decision that gave the President of the United States absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for conduct within his conclusive and preclusive authority, and after Judge Eileen Cannon decided to throw out the classified documents case, and after Trump's pick of J.D. Vance as his running mate, and a recent assassination attempt that made him come alive as a hero that many Republicans are comparing to the likes of Theodore Roosevelt, the GOP is now suddenly struggling to find a coherent line of attack against Vice President Harris. Their recent criticism of her hiring as a DEI, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion officer in the White House, smacks of desperation, as the move only strengthens her appeal among the diverse electorate that values inclusivity and progressive change. With the political stakes higher than ever, with the nation watching this closely, I'm so glad to be joined by Michigan State Senator Mallory McMorrow, who has been a dynamic force in state politics, championing causes from environmental justice to protecting voting rights. And her insights are sure to be invaluable. Senator McMorrow, thank you for being a part of the Political Mic today.
Thanks, Mike. Glad to be here in what is surely a historic week, although I feel like we've been saying that forever, but this feels very different in a big way.
So, Senator McMorrow, recently, as I alluded to a little bit earlier in the program, there have been so many virtual fundraising programs on behalf of Vice President Harris. Have you been a part of any of these efforts to get the Vice President elected?
I have. So much of this has happened really organically. And I will say, as somebody with deep respect for the president, you laid out his accomplishments. I said in the New York Times this past week, I think he's going to go down as one of the greatest presidents in the history of our country. And we saw very quickly when he decided to step down. I don't think people can understate how patriotic a decision that was to put the country above your own ambition, your own beliefs. I think has really motivated a lot of people, even people who may have really struggled because they love Joe Biden. They respect him as a president. So right away, we saw Win with Black Women was the first large online mobilizing effort. 44,000 Black women organized online, raised hundreds of thousands of dollars, encouraged each other on how to get engaged and volunteer. This was completely disconnected from the campaign. So people were doing this. And then last night, in response to that, Shannon Watts, who's the founder of Moms Demand Action, organized White Women for Kamala, which she called answering the call. So this was the response as a white woman myself. This is a knock on us. I was a part of this call last night. We had more than 140,000 participants on Zoom. Zoom has never had more than 100,000 participants. So we had to actually get engineers behind the scenes to design their system to increase the capacity. It crashed multiple times. At one point, we were raising more than $20,000 a minute and raised more than $2 million for the campaign, and shared a ton of really great tips for people who maybe have never been involved in the political process and don't know how, but feel the energy of this moment and the responsibility of this moment. So it was, I'm still reeling from it. I'm a little tired today. It was a late night call, probably wrapped up around 10 p.m. And I was just so excited that I couldn't get to sleep. So it feels good.
And Senator McMorrow, President Biden cited Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and George Washington in his address, framing his decision as one rooted in the defense of democracy. How important is it for leaders to invoke historical figures like these in their speeches? And what impact does this particular speech, do you think, have on the public perception so far?
I think it's critical, especially hearkening all the way back to George Washington. When we think about the founding of this country and what this country purported to stand for, that we were not a monarchy, that we were going to be a republic, and a republic if you can keep it. That was a line that the president referenced very intentionally. George Washington, our first president, there were no rules at the time. He was the first. He was in uncharted territory. He very likely could have decided, I'm going to stay here. I'm the president, I'm popular, but he set the precedent that the rest of us follow. And I think being able to hearken back to, not only great historical figures, but really what this country stands for, that a democracy and a republic requires everybody participating. It's not standing in line or falling in line behind one man. And I think that decision now makes such a stark contrast between the Democrats, who, and my firm belief is we're a big tent party. We are not the cult of personality party, and the Republican Party, which if you watched the Republican National Convention, which I did, it's very hard to see. Even a few years ago, the traditional Republican Party is no longer represented. It is now the MAGA Trump party. You didn't see Mitt Romney. You didn't see Liz Cheney. You didn't see kind of any of the Republican stalwarts that in a place like Michigan are very well respected. That's gone. So now the contrast is very clear. And I think President Biden really hearkening back to what our country is about and what we stand for, and his decision reflects the country.
And upon hearing the news, Donald Trump, the former president who's running again to succeed Joe Biden in the presidency, doubled down on the kind of rhetoric he's been using throughout his entire time in the political arena. He said that Joe Biden was the worst president of his lifetime. Keep in mind, this is the same Biden who called Donald Trump to ensure that he was doing okay after the recent assassination attempt on his life. And Donald Trump couldn't bring himself to no longer throw darts at Joe Biden. He had to get his last licks in. And the latest NPR poll shows mixed views on Biden's legacy. On January 20th of 2025, both Joe Biden and Donald Trump would have equally occupied the Oval Office for 4 years, both with dramatically different tenures in office. How do you think historical perspectives on Biden's presidency might evolve over time, especially in comparison to past presidents like Trump and even President Obama?
I think legacy is really hard to see in the current time. We have very short memories. We are living in a current moment where The American economy, by all accounts, is roaring, but that doesn't change the fact that a lot of people are still feeling the effects of inflation. So I can feel that there's tension between seeing all these news reports that, in the wake of COVID-19, the United States has recovered better than any G7 nation, certainly, and better than any other nation on the planet. But if you are still having trouble, buying chicken at the grocery store, that doesn't always connect. But I think as time goes on, and you will be able to see that, with first a very narrow majority and then a split Congress, the amount of legislation that the president was able to get through on, the fact that we have the first gun violence reform in my lifetime that passed through Congress. And that's an issue. Mike, I don't know how old you are. I'm going to guess we're relatively about the same age. That is something that for my generation and Gen Z deeply, deeply impacts us. And to see that got through on a bipartisan basis, I think history is going to look back on this legacy with a lot of reverence that maybe we don't necessarily feel right now. But I don't think you can ignore just the sheer amount of accomplishments. And that really goes to who Joe Biden is. He is a creature of the Senate. He came up in the Senate, in his late 30s and believed that this was a place where we could work across the aisle and work together. And he's always believed in that. And I think that's why you see the amount that has been accomplished, even in this divisive time, because he believes the system works.
And also in a recent poll, Vice President Harris and former President Trump are neck and neck in Michigan, your state, both polling at 41%. With such a tight race, what do you think are some of the key factors driving this deadlock?
So I first want to point out just how radically the race has changed, even in the last week. There was a poll out actually the day that President Biden announced later in the afternoon that he would be stepping down, that showed that the president was losing in Metro Detroit, which has never happened. If you lose in Metro Detroit, you've lost the state. So he was at some point, 7 points down. And now the fact that a week later the race is neck and neck means it's a whole new race. What I can tell you about Michigan is that I think that there is a ceiling for Trump and that he is at that ceiling. We saw a very significant vote for Nikki Haley in the GOP primary in places like Oakland County, where I live, and Kent County, areas that, are suburban, highly educated, that will very likely make or break the race. And I think for Vice President Harris, this is her floor. This is her introduction. And I only think she has room to grow from here so long as she gets out and aggressively campaigns, which by all accounts that we're seeing so far is happening. So I think it's really exciting. And for Michigan, this is a place that has been at the epicenter of so much. The battle around the 2020 election. There is still clips and footage that will haunt me forever of, the kind of chaos that happened at the TCF counting center down in Detroit. My husband was there that night, kind of making sure that poll counters and poll workers and challengers were being respected. Meanwhile, we saw the Oakland County Republican Party had sent out a mass email encouraging people to flood the facility, knowing that they could not get in. It was just chaos. And what I tell people about Michigan, because they always ask me, what's the one issue that's going to move Michigan? Michigan is a state of incredibly diverse by all metrics. Really good, hardworking people who want to move on. We don't want to relitigate the 2020 election. We do not want to live back in, whether or not the actions taken during the pandemic were the right actions. People want to move forward. And I think the contrast of these two campaigns now is really kind of that, excuse my very simple language, but it's about vibes, right? Do you want to go back and do you want to stay in a time of grievance, or do you want to move forward? And I think that that's really going to resonate with people here.
This race seems to have changed in the fact that it pits the Trump coalition, which is a predominantly white coalition that feels as if the government has overlooked them and that the country is changing too fast and that the things that they used to hold dear from the past are being lost and taken away from them. And then there's the coalition that Obama was able to come into the White House with, a multiracial, generally young coalition that were brought into the political arena for the first time for many of them. And Kamala Harris seems like she has to tap into that same coalition to have a good shot at the presidency. So both coalitions, the Obama coalition and the Trump coalition, seem to be going to be at odds this November. Given the razor thin margin by which Harris is either leading or tied or behind Trump in some of these battleground states, what strategies should the Democrats employ to ensure that they secure these critical votes?
So in a state like Michigan, we now on the state level are operating under a Democratic trifecta. That means the governorship, the state house, and the state senate are all controlled by Democrats for the first time since 1984. We also have built up Lavora Barnes, who's our state party chair, years ago built up what she called Project 83, which is an all 83 county organizing strategy. There is a full-time organizer in every single county every year, year round. So we don't have to build up this infrastructure every time it's an election season. And it has allowed us to kind of get the message out to voters about who we are as Democrats. You know, this is a state that's led by Gretchen Whitmer, who is wildly popular as a governor. And I think that she appeals to people because she talks like a normal person. Like she can talk to you about the supply chain and the manufacture of electric vehicles as much as she can talk to you about her favorite like cheap beer and the best happy hour in downtown Lansing. So I think that that's the strategy, is just get out and meet people. It's really hard for people to trust people they don't know and haven't met. We are also a state, you know, I live in Oakland County, just north of Detroit. And this is historically one of the most self-segregated areas in the entire country. My current district, I represent both Detroit and the suburbs, and I have some residents on either side of 8 Mile who have never been to the other side. You know, it's a mile away, if that, you know, not even, you can walk across to the other side. So I think it's just encouraging people to get out there and meet each other. That's something that I try to do and take very seriously when I host district events. Is, you know, it's not an Oakland County event. It's not a Detroit event. This is my district event. Please come out and meet each other. And then for the campaign, tapping into a lot of the infrastructure that we already have built up, because we're organizing in the suburbs, in the cities, way up north in the Upper Peninsula, which is an entire other peninsula of Michigan that touches Wisconsin, to talk about rural issues, agricultural issues. We've got an incredible tourism industry. We have a wine industry. We have a beer industry. And if we can show, I think, the contrast, like I said, I just go back to vibes. A lot of people are really tired and they're exhausted and they don't want to hear about culture war issues. So we saw this happen in 2022, where the Republican slate was running really hard against, you know, trans kids playing soccer, which is not an issue here in Michigan. Our high school athletic association has had a policy in place and it's worked for 10 years. And we had voters flat out say to us, like, I care about the cost of housing. I don't care about whether or not a kid plays soccer. So that's on us. That's on us getting the message out, but I feel really confident in our ability to do that.
And another recent poll indicated that independent candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has a notable 10% support among Michigan voters, with 6% still undecided. Now, with the challenge of reintroducing or introducing Kamala Harris with a little over 100 days before the general election, how do you see this affecting the overall race? And what steps can Harris take to win over these independent voters and undecided voters? You know, a lot of criticism went into the Biden versus Trump rematch because people wanted something new. Well, the Democratic Party just gave that to them.
Exactly. You know, I think that that introduction is going to make a lot of difference. And I can tell you from where I sit, when RFK announced, he had a rally here in Royal Oak, in the city where I live. He had, you know, a stand-up comedy night at the Royal Oak Music Theater. And I saw, you know, signs around town. I saw they had a very large presence at the St. Patrick's Day parade. That has since dwindled. So between St. Patrick's Day, not that parades or metrics, but it's what I see. So from St. Patrick's Day to the 4th of July, then when I was in the parade, it was a much smaller presence for RFK. And I think two things have to happen simultaneously. Number one, people need to learn who RFK is, because I think for a lot of voters, you know, you hear a Kennedy and you think, wow, that's a great alternative. We love the Kennedys. We have a tremendous amount of respect. But then you learn that the rest of his family, every single member of his family, endorsed President Biden and is now largely supporting Vice President Harris, and that he's the outlier. You know, he's got very extreme views on vaccines, and Michigan, particularly Metro Detroit, we were hit one of the hardest places in the country at the outset of the COVID pandemic. There were body bags piled up in closets in hospitals. This is something that hits home hard for people. So I think that there's some education that has to happen about who he actually is and what he stands for. You know, the fact that he got on a phone call with Donald Trump and it sounded like was willing to kind of entertain a position in the administration. It's not a Democrat. It's not JFK. It's RFK Jr. And then to your point about the desire to look for another alternative, a lot of people, like I said, don't want to go backwards. I think there was a lot of resentment about looking at a rematch of 2020. That's now not on the table anymore. So this is just going to require the vice president to get out and introduce herself. I think she's got the name recognition. People know who Vice President Kamala Harris is, but they don't really know her yet. And that's just going to take energy and campaigning and time. And we got, 101 days to do it.
And Michigan's significant Arab American population, particularly affected by President Biden's handling of the Israel-Gaza conflict, is another factor. Going back to the primary season, many voted not uncommitted in the Michigan primary. This presents a unique challenge. How can Harris address these concerns and regain the trust and support of this critical demographic?
So something that I think was missed in the coverage of the uncommitted vote in the primary is, number one, the Arab American population, like any population, is not a monolith. There are very conservative Arab Americans who are always going to be voting for Donald Trump. There are much more progressive Arab Americans who have long sided with the Democratic Party. And what I found heartening was that the uncommitted vote was happening on the Democratic side, which I think in a primary is a way to signal to the party that you support, hey, we want to be with you. We just need to see some changes. It wasn't happening on the Republican side. I think there is an understanding. I think, Jared Kushner said something to the effect of Gaza would make great beachfront property if we can redevelop it. Like, it's not going to be better at all if Donald Trump is in office. And I think that there's a wide understanding of that. I just heard from one of the uncommitted delegates. There was a radio show here who has been working with the movement, who expressed a lot of cautious optimism with the vice president. The fact that she was one of the first people to call for a ceasefire. And I remember watching that video where, I think she was at a rally and people saw it and said like, oh, I don't know if she was allowed to say that. And I think that gained her a lot of credibility for standing up for what is right. She put out a statement yesterday on the war in Gaza that I think strikes the right balance, that I think a majority of people want to see the hostages returned, want to see the war end, want to see an end of this violence. And that, is kind of the big tent solution that I think everybody is looking for. So I think that there is a willingness of folks who voted for uncommitted to vote with the vice president, but like everything, they want to meet her and they want to find out more.
And youth voter turnout is also going to be critical in this election. You go back to 2020 and 2022, and youth voter turnout improved, but it's still not at the level it should be. Vice President Kamala Harris has gotten so much excitement on the internet with TikTok, with Twitter, with Gen Z and millennial voters being key to Biden's 2020 victory. How pivotal do you think their support will be for Harris's path for the presidency, especially with the 20-point lead she holds over Trump among young voters? And how can she maintain this energy and make sure that it translates into actual votes?
Oh, it's huge. So Michigan had the highest youth turnout in the entire country in the last election. And I say that and then say, follow up with the percentage. We had the highest at, and I think it was like 36.7%, which you hear those numbers and you're like, there's a disconnect here. We saw incredible youth enthusiasm, particularly around our colleges and universities in Michigan in the last election. And there was a lot on the line in the last election. It was Governor Whitmer was on the ballot. We had Prop 3, which was a ballot initiative to codify Roe in our state constitution. And I think the simplicity of both of those two things really drove a lot of young people out to vote. We also have expanded access to the ballot here in Michigan. So we now have in-person election day registration. So you can come and register on election day, which we had a huge issue in Michigan of college students missing their first election because traditionally you had to register at your home address. So if you live, at where I live, but you go to school in Ann Arbor, yeah, it's less than an hour away, but I don't know about what your life was like, but when I was like 19, I was not driving an hour both ways if I didn't have to. So we've made it a lot easier. We have expanded early voting, so you can now vote 9 days early across the state. You can vote no reason absentee, so vote by mail if you want to. We've expanded drop boxes. So I know that in people like my position for the Secretary of State, this year is about education to let particularly young people know we've made voting so much easier that there is no excuse not to do it. You can do it at home. You can kind of look up your ballot and scroll through. You can watch all the fan cams on TikTok that you want, I guess, if that inspires you to vote. And then you can just drop that ballot in the ballot box. So that's a big push. And I think it's going to be huge to victory in November for sure.
And Harris's ability to engage with younger voters on social media seems to be such a major factor so far in this young candidacy. It's only been not even a full week yet. And so far, I've already heard so much about a coconut meme.
Yeah.
Given that 45% of young people have a favorable opinion of Kamala Harris compared to 33% for Biden and 34% for Trump, what specific policies or messages do you think resonate most with younger voters? Or is this just the excitement of the historic candidacy that this is?
I think it's a combination of all of the above. I don't want to, and I think too many politicians underestimate young voters and say, oh, they don't really care about issues. Excuse my language, but that's bullshit. I walked into a high school in my district, 2 years ago in the wake of a speech that I gave that went viral. It was a crazy day. But, in a high school, I was hammered with questions by high schoolers about, is Roe going to fall? Why are there all these bills attacking the LGBTQ community? What can we do about gun violence? I mean, this is a state where we had the Oxford high school shooting, which now has the first shooting ever where the parents were charged in that shooting. And then just a few months later, 14 months later, was the shooting at Michigan State University. So there are kids who survived one school shooting only to survive another one, which is devastating. They are plugged in and they are aware. I also think that there is a lot of energy enthusiasm. The first ad that the Harris campaign put out was just joyful and enthusiastic. You've got Beyonce in the background, but the imagery I feel like for so many years, we've had just kind of the competition of perceived evils. Republicans are attacking Democrats because they're evil. Democrats are attacking Republicans because they're evil. And it feels like this campaign is rejecting that and trying to lead with joy, which is authentic to who she is. I know that the Republicans are trying to attack her laugh, but you're attacking joy. And I think that that is really infectious to a lot of people and a lot of young people who say, I don't want to be miserable all the time. I don't want to be miserable. It's pretty simple. But, then you add on reproductive rights and gun violence and voting rights and climate change. And there's a pretty clear winner there.
And the recent WDIV Detroit news poll shows the vice president commanding an overwhelming 82.1% support among Black voters in Michigan, while Trump received zero support. How significant? How significant is this disparity for the Harris campaign, and what does it reveal about the political landscape?
It's huge. Trump did this thing a couple of months ago, and I was so angry watching national reporters cover this, where it said, Trump speaks at a Black church in Detroit. Okay, that was the venue. That's true. But if you looked at the audience, it was almost entirely white. So the fact that they were trying to do this, like, oh, we're going into Detroit and we're talking to voters for the first time and we're really reaching out. No, you're just using a venue. You rented a venue. Get over it. And I think you see that in the fact that he's polling at 0%. Like I said, I represent part of Detroit. There is no patience for nonsense in an electorate that, like, too many people gloss over for too long. This is a city that went through bankruptcy. It is people who want to see genuine authenticity and a commitment to investment into racial equality, into, responsible policing. We have had a really steep reduction in violence in the city, but that doesn't mean it's done. The number of kids that we've lost just this summer to accidental gun violence, like getting a hold of a gun that is loaded and unsecured in the home is absolutely devastating. So that's huge. And you see it right away. I mean, when I saw that poll and I saw 0%, I was like, oh man, you're in a rough spot, sir. But the vice president has a huge advantage with Black voters, with Indian voters. The Indian auntie movement is like, there's a whole other social media feed going on about that right now. And she can lean into her story, which to me is really exciting as a woman candidate, because I feel like for so long women were told to kind of hide who they are. You have to present, as what you think a successful man could look like. And she's leaning into every aspect of who she actually is. And that's just really exciting.
And the Republicans are struggling to find something that they could use to really brand her with. Trump, of course, is someone who has prided himself in being a master at branding his opponents, all the way back from low energy Jeb to Lion Ted to Crooked Hillary to Sleepy Joe. And now he's struggling to find something to stick to his current rival, Vice President Kamala Harris. I remember listening to, folks like David Plouffe and John Favreau and folks who worked on the Obama campaign back in 2008. And they said one of the things Obama said to his staff was that I don't want to see controversies of my staff in the New York Times headlines. Yeah. Do you foresee any risks for Harris going forward with this condensed campaign season for her if the media coverage shifts? A lot of folks are saying, well, this is a honeymoon period. This is going to burst soon. Do you see any risk for Harris if the media coverage shifts or if new controversies emerge? And how should her campaign prepare for and respond for such scenarios?
For sure. So I'll address the first part of your question first. I don't think the Trump campaign is prepared for Gen Z. And I say that because every attack they've tried to levy at her gets flipped on its head and turned into a meme and like an internet sensation. And, the coconut tree thing is the perfect example. This was, a speech she gave, I think an invocation, something that nobody would have ever seen, where she referenced her mom, who would always make fun of her and say, what, did you just fall out of a coconut tree? And then, went into the line that she always says of you exist in the context of everything you are and all that came before you. And, they found this clip and they posted it, and it was supposed to be an attack on, what is she even talking about, I guess, was sort of the scenario. But now it's like remixed into songs. The amount of people who have coconut tree emojis like in their handles, I just don't think, I feel like every attack they'll levy at her, everybody around her will just own. There was a clip of Trump at a rally where he said something like, oh, she's out there saying I'm a prosecutor versus the felon. And they just took that verbatim and then put at the end, I'm Kamala Harris and I support this message. It was perfect. It's picture perfect. So I think the strategy on that is don't take the bait, which I feel like so many people, when you get attacked, your instinct is to defend yourself, and they're just turning it on its head. And then in terms of the media landscape, and I think this was something that we touched on in our organizing call last night, of course, the honeymoon phase is going to end or wind down. And that's why it's so important for all of us to step up and realize it's our turn. The first 24, 48, 72, however many hours we're in now, is going to be nonstop media coverage because it's new. But we on the ground have to be the ones to make those moments, to talk to people at the doors, to have rallies, to have events, to get her out there. There's going to be challenges. We saw that this week with the protests in Washington around Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit. And I think the vice president has navigated that fairly deftly. She got attacked by the Republicans for choosing not to be present and preside over the chamber when the prime minister was there, which, going back to kind of some of the uncommitted vote, that garnered a lot of support with people who think that Netanyahu has gone too far. She also came out and decried, defacing property and burning the American flag, which again, that is where most people are. So I think so far she's navigated it well. But that's something that I think I take ownership of. And I think a lot of people who have been involved in some of these calls take ownership is we know that the media honeymoon period is going to fade, and 101 days is not a lot of time, but it is time. It's not a week. So we're going to have to sustain this energy all the way to the end.
And we've seen Republicans, including former President Trump, commentators on Fox News and Newsmax, struggling to find a consistent line of attack. And they've tried to attack her by saying that she's a DEI hire, a diversity, equity, and inclusion hire. How effective do you think these efforts have been, and what do you think they reveal about the current political strategy of the GOP? And I find it interesting that these attacks come after the monumental Supreme Court decision recently, in, I believe in 2022 or 23, that basically told universities and administration that diversity can no longer be a major factor in their decisions to take on new students.
Right. Well, and I think this goes back to the comment I made earlier about Trump hitting his ceiling in Michigan. This type of rhetoric turns people off here. There's a reason why in 2022, when I was attacked by, kind of some wild accusations about grooming and supporting DEI initiatives, and I stood up against it, most people rallied around me because you're just attacking the person and you're not talking about the issue. And I think most people see through that. And for a lot of women, we know what it's like to be diminished and have our careers not taken seriously. This is an incredibly accomplished woman who is a lawyer, a prosecutor, has a long history of fighting and winning for, really horrific sexual violence crimes, for going up against big banks. I mean, she has a serious career. I know that I've seen some of the Republicans pointing to, well, Joe Biden said he wanted to have a Black woman as the vice president. Yeah, because it was time, and she's the most qualified person, hands down, to be the vice president. So I think it's a real turnoff for people. And if they need to pick up either those independent voters from the RFK camp or try to bring voters over from the Democratic side, they're not going to do it by saying she's a DEI candidate.
Yeah, and for those, Trump supporters who are so confident this summer, I mean, I was saying to myself, Trump couldn't have had orchestrated a better summer for himself. He got absolute immunity from the Supreme Court, Judge Eileen Cannon, throughout the classified documents case. And that confidence seemed to lead to the choice of J.D. Vance, a choice that seemed to double down on the fact that this is someone who's looking for a guy, an ace in the hole, who, when push comes to shove, will not be loyal to the Constitution like Mike Pence, someone who will overturn the election if need be. And it's a full MAGA ticket. Now there seems to be some apprehension with, comments of J.D. Vance surfacing, criticizing cat ladies, saying that, Democrats who don't have children don't have a vested interest in the future. And how can we trust them with our democracy if they have no vested interest in the future? What are your thoughts about the choice of J.D. Vance and how that might impact Trump's chances this November?
I think you're right. I think it was a pick made with absolute confidence that there was going to be a massive red wave. It wasn't strategic. And I think that is in line with what we've seen from Trump and the Republican Party. I was with a group of bipartisan elected officials down at the state level in a fellowship that I am part of when Trump got shot. And, it's a lot of us across the aisle who understood how horrific that moment was. And then our follow-up conversation is, well, what is he going to do next? Is he going, for most people, if somebody tries to kill you, you're a changed person. And, I know that there was a lot of coverage of that he had written a new speech, that there was going to be this feeling of unity. And then we didn't see any of that. The prepared remarks that he gave in his speech at the RNC alluded to unity, but then you saw one of the reporters I was listening to said you could see the teleprompter stop and then he would go off script for 30 minutes. And then it was back to the same grievances and the Democrats and the witch hunt. And, then they started passing out official Republican Party placards that said mass deportations now. So it's just, the pick of J.D. Vance to me signaled exactly that they were in this mindset that they had successfully taken over the Republican Party, that they don't need to attract any more votes, that this is a home run. And that's going to backfire. And, I think a lot of the negatives for J.D. Vance is he's just kind of weird and off-putting. He came up with writing Hillbilly Elegy and leaning into coming up in Appalachia, but then got educated at Yale and was a crypto bro and, really close with Peter Thiel. And you see him trying to do this I'm one of you thing. And it comes across as very disingenuous. And, the fact that he's on record so many times saying how horrible he thinks Donald Trump is. He called him Hitler. He called him, what was it? Like a
He said he would
fentanyl.
vote. Yeah, he voted for his dog before he would vote
For his dog before that. He said he was like heroin. And I saw Pete Buttigieg say this very eloquently that, if you actually come up in Appalachia, given the opioid crisis, that's like the worst thing you can say about somebody. And then to just turn around and say, oh, I'm all in now. Like, people can see through that. That's just opportunism. And you see somebody who's willing to say and do anything and doesn't actually stand for anything. And I think, again, if you're looking at, politics is all about strategy, and your pick of your vice president should usually, it doesn't make a huge impact, but if it does make an impact, you want it to expand the map, not negate your map. And I think for any, particularly women who may have been undecided, he's a real weird turnoff of a guy.
Yeah. And then you have the policies that they're advocating for. I mean, their position of abortion, immigration, as you alluded to, Project 2025, which has garnered so much attention, that the Heritage Foundation put out. And now I've even seen folks on the Trump campaign trying to distance the candidate from that agenda by saying, well, he's not officially endorsed it, but good and well that this is what they're going to be enacting if they get the opportunity. And so they countered with something along the lines of Project 47. But it's really, it comes down to the consolidation of power in the executive branch and the removal of the administrative state. I mean, Project 2025 will be Project 2029 if Kamala Harris is elected and they get their way and win in 2028. And they'll just keep going down the road as long as MAGA is in control of the Republican Party. Could you share some of your insights about their positions on some of these key issues like abortion, like immigration, environmental justice, and also Project 2025?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. I've been in this job now for 6 years, and I came from the private sector before this. And one of the hardest things that I've had to grapple with is realizing that I work with people in the government who ran for office because they want to break the government, which is a very strange thing for me. I think all of us can have complaints about when it doesn't work well, or it's too bloated, or it needs to be improved, which is why I ran. Let's try to make it better and serve people. But Project 2025 is all about dismantling the government and installing in all of the state departments, full Trump loyalists. And the most simple way to put it is we're no longer a democracy or a republic at point. That's a monarchy. You're putting your people in behind you. You're not putting healthcare experts in the State Department. They want to eliminate the Department of Education. They want to eliminate NOAA, so we won't have any weather reports, like just absolute crazy stuff. And then, it's about control. So there's that aspect of it, the kind of dismantling of government and installing, Trump loyalists or whoever, the nominee would be if it comes out of the Heritage Foundation. And then there's just control of residents. The issue of abortion, however you personally feel about it, and I was raised Catholic, it is about knowing that if and when I decide to get pregnant, which should be my decision, should be nobody else's, that if something goes wrong, and it does way too frequently, that you will have access to healthcare no matter what. I know that none of us ever want to be in this position, but I've had constituents who, have had to go through the very heartbreaking experience of a late term termination when, after the 20-week scan, there was a horrible fetal anomaly that the collagen wasn't growing. So there were no bones, kind of developing in the baby's body. And they walked me through how horrible, they had picked out a name, they had picked out furniture. This was somebody they desperately wanted in their life. And to find out that it was just failing was devastating. And to deprive people of that opportunity, my constituents told me their doctors advised that if they hadn't been able to terminate their pregnancy when they did, they very likely would never have been able to get pregnant again. Devastating. And you're going to tell, this is like 0.0002% of abortions take place every year that are this late. But you hear the rhetoric around it, and it's, post-birth abortion, which is not a thing. Infanticide is not legal. but you're going to make the hardest decision of somebody's life that much harder with no basis in reality. It's ironic to me because the Republican Party has always purported to be the party of individual liberties and freedoms, but they want to tell you what you can do with your body, what you can do with your pregnancy, what you can read or not read. JD Vance apparently thinks you should only be allowed to vote if you're a parent. And made fun of Pete Buttigieg because if you're gay parents, that doesn't count. It's crazy. If you don't fit into this very neat mold of what they think is acceptable, they're going to legislate you out of existence.
And then there's the attack on Democrats saying that, I've had, for instance, my last recent guest, the former director of the executive, the former executive for the Republican Party for the state of Florida, Jamie Miller. And I've heard other Republicans say this, that Democrats are responsible for the recent attack on Donald Trump's life because of the rhetoric that they use. And there was criticism about Biden's speech and his particular use of the phrase bullseye. But, I've always said a second-year law student could tell you that you have to look at the full context before word could be equated or constitute incitement to violence. And then I challenged him about that, about, Trump's many calls to fight like hell, otherwise we won't have a country anymore, or, to knock them out and he'll pay for the legal fees, and his longing for the days when folks be carried out on stretchers, and their praise of Kyle Rittenhouse, a teenager who rose to prominence among the right solely because he killed two protesters who were standing in solidarity with Black Lives Matter and got acquitted on all charges. How do you feel about the assertions that Democrats are responsible for political violence against leaders like Donald Trump, and that both sides, and then when you bring up these instances, they want to both sides this argument?
Ultimately, I don't think that solves the issues. We are not a country of Democrats and Republicans. We're a country of 330 million people. And I was, here in Michigan, we had an armed protest in our capital on April 30th of 2020, well before January 6th. And there were heavily armed gunmen, full tactical gear, carrying AR-15s. Some looks like they had like grenades in their pockets. It was like they were in our Senate chambers above my head. So I looked up and there were men with huge rifles. And if a single one of them put their fingers on the triggers, I was talking to one of our sergeants a few days afterward, there would be nothing they could do. I was given a bulletproof vest to wear to work for a while. And I don't think it does us any good in this moment to say, oh, well, it's the Republicans' fault because they're saying this, or it's the Democrats' fault. Anybody can ascribe blame. I want to be somebody who says, well, how do we fix it? Nobody in any elected office or anybody at all, whether you go to church or a movie theater or to school, should have to worry about being shot and killed, period. How do we solve this issue? We have way too many guns in this country. It is too easy for people to access high-powered firearms. I don't think anybody would argue that this shooter who shot at Donald Trump should have had an AR-15. Why did he have that? Anybody who's in the mental state where they are willing to kill another person probably shouldn't have access to firearms. And I know that's probably controversial within certain gun rights groups, but that's where I come from, because I don't, it's a temporary solution, I guess, to say, well, it's their fault because their rhetoric is worse than our rhetoric. But at the end of the day, everybody should be safe walking around in this country. We should all want to bring the heat down. And I do think about rhetoric a lot. And that's why I think I am so fired up by this campaign, because it does feel like it's been a pivot to, we're not going to attack them. They're going to attack us, but we're going to look forward. And I think that helps. But yeah, I think you can blame everybody for rhetoric, but rhetoric didn't pick up a gun and pull the trigger.
Right. And this Sunday made me think a lot about the devastation that folks back in 1963, November 22nd, had when President Kennedy was killed. Now, Biden, of course, is alive, but the fact that people felt robbed of a second term, what could be, if he's had this successful of a tenure, what could we look forward to? I've always thought that Biden would be a more progressive candidate. A more progressive president in his second term. Now, For those who are wondering where Kamala Harris stands on domestic policy, foreign policy, how do you think she would fulfill the unfinished work of the Biden-Harris administration? We still haven't had the John Lewis Voting Rights Act.
Right.
Roe versus Wade is not codified yet. We still have to do more on environmental, in the environmental front, addressing climate change, environmental injustice. Criminal justice reform still has to, have some meaningful legislation. Your thoughts?
So this was actually, and I think a lot of people don't remember it, but when the 2020 primary was going on and there were, like 9,000 people running for president, this was the knock on Biden, that there was a critique of, well, people don't really know where he stands on issues. And over his lifetime, he's changed on a lot of issues, criminal justice being one of them, that is pointed to very frequently, abortion being another one. And I think why he won in 2020 and why he's been so effective as a president is recognizing that it's not about your own ideology. When you're in that role, you are the leader. You have to respond to the moment. You have to figure out who you can work with and how you can strategize in both chambers of Congress to move policies that benefit the most number of people. And I think it requires a level of flexibility that I don't think is very satisfying to many people when they want to hear, like, well, where are you on this issue and this issue and this issue? But I counter that by saying, when people demand to know where a single politician stands on every single issue, I think it almost presents a false promise, because no single elected official, including the president, can enact any agenda on their own. So I think in a lot of ways, the vice president is cut from the same cloth. We've seen her be very tough when she's in a prosecutor role. Again, I go back to 2020. I think she struggled to find a lane. She wasn't a far left progressive. She wasn't an extreme moderate. I don't think she quite figured out where to fit in. But in this moment, maybe that's exactly who we need, because I agree with you that I think the accomplishments of the first term of the Biden-Harris administration need to be protected and expanded upon. And I think that is the argument that she should make to people, and where I think she stands. But a lot of that is going to depend on, can we flip the House to have Democrats in control again? Because all of those things you mentioned, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act is not going to get a hearing, let alone passage, if Republicans are in charge of the House under Mike Johnson. It's just not. If the Senate flips, who knows what's going to happen? So that's what I think is important in this moment. So I almost turn it on its head and people say, like, who is she? Where does she stand? You want somebody who isn't so dead set in their own ideology that they're not willing to listen to the needs of the people around them.
And the irony is Trump has no ideology.
Well, right. I mean, this is a man who donated to Kamala Harris when she was running for AG.
And Hillary Clinton. But before I let you go, Senator, there's been a lot of talk about who the potential vice presidential running mate for Vice President Harris could be. Names such as Andy Beshear, the governor of Kentucky, who's won 2 consecutive terms in that state, winning over many Trump voters. You have J.D. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, where the DNC is going to be held later this summer. You have Pete Buttigieg, Secretary of Transportation for President Biden. You have Mark Kelly, someone who was in a very narrow race against Blake Masters. I'm not sure if another Democrat can come that close. It was a very tight race in the state of Arizona. And then you have Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, a key state for Biden's victory in 2020 and for any Democrat in this modern era. But then there's also Gretchen Whitmer, and a lot of folks are hesitant and they say, well, I don't know if the country will be ready for 2 women on the ticket. Then there's some folks that say, look, if they elect one woman on the ticket, they'll elect both. Do you have a preferred candidate, or do you think that Gretchen Whitmer should be on the ticket, or do you think that would pose a potential risk for Harris's chances going in this November?
I hope we're past a place where those risks are real. I ran for the first time in 2018, which is the first time Gretchen was running for governor as well. And there's one city in my old district where you could vote a straight woman ticket all the way down. It was governor, secretary of state, attorney general, Congress, U.S. Senate, down to your county commission. And it was so wild, and people were so excited. And I think you look at Michigan. Michigan is a battleground swing state where we have like the worst political violence, I would argue, that you could see. And this is a state that's currently led by all women. All of our statewides are women. They all got elected. And I think a lot of people said they couldn't. So I do think there's a case to be made for going for it. I think the energy we've seen over the past week, when a lot of people, even maybe a few weeks ago, were hemming and hawing about, should it be the vice president? Is she going to attract people? And you've seen this like coalescence around her. I think people are ready for something different. Now, that being said, Gretchen has said in no uncertain terms many, many times she is not in the running for it. So I'm going to take her at a word for that. I do think it needs to be somebody from the middle of the country. I think that somebody from the state level really makes sense. I think what we saw with Secretary Clinton was that a lot of people that I talked to couldn't bring themselves to vote for her, not because she was a woman, but because of kind of this institutional persona that she was, from Washington. She was married to the president. She had always been in elected office, and it just felt inaccessible to a lot of people. I like Shapiro quite a bit. Anybody who can live stream rebuilding I-95 and bring Gritty out like on a fire truck is very exciting for me. I know he's got some issues with the school vouchers issue, and the education community has kind of come out against it. I tweeted the other day, and some people were like, is she serious? Gary Peters is our senator from Michigan. He is a veteran, a dear friend of mine. Like, I adore him. He was also the first U.S. senator in history to share a personal abortion story. He and his first wife had to terminate a pregnancy, and he shared that story in the middle of a nail biter of a campaign in his last cycle and won. He chairs the Homeland Security Committee. He just passed legislation through his committee to ban legislators from trading stocks, which I think is a pretty good thing we should be doing. So he's kind of my dark horse for somebody from the middle of the country, who's kind of your super likable, nerdy Eagle Scout dad, who I think would balance the ticket really well.
And I also forgot to mention Roy Cooper, the governor of my home state, North Carolina. He's in the running. And North Carolina is also interesting because you have this guy, Mark Robinson. Every day there's something going on. But Senator McMorrow, thank you so much for sharing your insights. As this political landscape continues to evolve, voices like yours will be crucial in shaping the future. And I appreciate and forever am grateful for the time that you spent on this platform. You're always welcome. Hope to have you back soon. Thank you so much for what you brought to the Political Mic today.
Thank you. This is great, Mike. Thanks.
All right. With that being said, that's going to conclude this episode of the Political Mic. Thanks for tuning in.
Hi, it's Mike Taylor, the host of the Political Mic podcast. If you like what you heard tonight, I want to invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I also want to ask you to please follow along on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and Amazon Music. You can also follow along and keep up with the conversation through our Telegram channel. Follow us on Twitter at @ThePolyMike, and follow us on Instagram. Thank you so much, and no matter what part of the political spectrum that you fall on, I want to encourage you to stay engaged, stay a part of the conversation, and stay informed. Thank you.